ሰላም ጤና ይስጥልን የተከበራችሁ ተመልካቾቻችን እንደምን ሰነበታችሁ። ከአስራት ዋሽንግተን ዲሲ እንግዳ ይዘንላችሁ ቀርበናል። የዛሬ እንግዳችን ዴቪድ ስታይመን ይባላሉ። ነዋሪነታቸው በአሜሪካ ኒውዮርክ ነው። ዴቪድ ስታይመን በተለይም የኢትዮጵያ ተቃዋሚዎችን ለዩኤስ ኮንግረስ እንዲሁም ደግሞ በኢትዮጵያ እየተፈጸመ ያለውን የሰብአዊ መብት ጥሰትና ሙስና ከ1992 እንደ አውሮፓውያን አቆጣጠር ገና ህወሓት ከመግባቱ ጀምሮ እስካሁን ድረስ ባለው ሁኔታ ለዓለምና ለአሜሪካ ኮንግረስ በማሳወቅ ይታወቃሉ። እንዲሁም ደግሞ በ1997 በተካሄደው ምርጫ ቅንጅትን ከጀርባ ሆነው ያማከሩ እንደነበረ በተለይም ሰላማዊ ትግልን በማቀንቀን የሚታወቁ ናቸው። በዚህ ዓመት ደግሞ ጠቅላይ ሚኒስትር አብይ የተሸለሙበት ዓመት ማለት ነው የኖቤል ተሸላሚ ለመሆን ኖሚኔት ተደርገው የነበሩ ሰው ናቸው። ስታይመን ዘንድሮ አዲስ መጽሐፍ ጽፈዋል። መጽሐፋቸው በኢትዮጵያ ላይ የሚያጠነጥን ነው። እንግዲህ በመጽሐፋቸውና በአጠቃላይ በኢትዮጵያ ፖለቲካ ጉዳይ እዚህ አስራት ዋሽንግተን ዲሲ ስቱዲዮ ጋብዘናቸዋል። የተለያዩ ጥያቄዎችን እያነሳን ውይይት ነው የምናደርግ የሚሆነው። ቆይታ በእንግሊዝኛ ቋንቋ ይሆናል ማለት ነው። ወደ እርሳቸው ከማምራቴ በፊት ግን ለእንግሊዝኛ ተናጋሪዎች አስተዋውቄ በቀጥታ ወደ ውይይቱ አልፋለሁ ማለት ነው። Hello everyone, thank you for joining us. This is Asrat guest. I am Ayale Unwar. Today we have a special guest, David Steinman. David Steinman is a well-known revolutionist. He was one of the Western advocates who exposed TPLF's human rights abuse through mainstream Western media, starting from 1996. He was also a strategic advisor of Knijit, and he was nominated for the 2019 Nobel Peace Prize. Today he is here to discuss about the current political situation of Ethiopia and about his new book. Thank you for coming to our studio, Mr. David Steinman.
You're very welcome.
Let's talk about your involvement in Ethiopian politics first, then we will go to the book later on. How did you get involved in Ethiopian politics?
Well, I had been working on democracy struggles in other countries for a number of years, already back in the 1980s. And just by coincidence, I happened to meet Princess Galila Saleh Selassie, and her then husband, Prince Ermias. And Princess Galila's uncle was Dr. Asrat Waldeus. And we just happened to meet socially, but when we got to talking and they learned that I had some experience with democracy promotion abroad, and in fact that I had been working with an organization that had been providing some private support to the TPLF and the EPLF during the struggle against Mengistu, we already had a little bit in common, and they asked me if I would try to give some advice to the Olamhara People's Organization, which was in its very early stages of formation. And as I got familiar with the situation over there, and saw that Dr. Asrat, whom I admired greatly, was persecuted, I became increasingly interested in seeing if Ethiopia could be helped to experience a transition to democracy. It turned out to be a much longer struggle than I ever anticipated, because this was back in 1991, 92, and I never imagined it would take so long. But the more I learned about Ethiopia and its politics, the more convinced I became that political reform was necessary to solve the humanitarian crisis, the extreme poverty. And that was really my primary interest, to try to make a dent in those problems. And when I saw that political reform was an under-recognized but very necessary step to dealing with the poverty, I decided that I would try to be supportive of that democratization process.
How do you see the current struggle of Amhara people?
Well, there are several different dimensions to the problem. the Amhara have been weakened to some extent by TPLF policies for many years, and it's going to take them a long time to recover from that. But I also believe that they have fantastic potential to regenerate themselves. They have a very strong culture, and they're wonderful, smart, industrious, intelligent people. And there's every possibility that they can move from the present situation to a more positive one. I think it's very important that they not allow themselves to be trapped by the attempts to force them to think exclusively in ethnic identity terms. One of the things I admire about the Amhara is they do have a national identity as Ethiopians at the same time that they have the Amhara identity. I think there's been a lot of effort to make them forget the national identity and to emphasize the Amhara identity, which is a natural reaction to anyone who is persecuted because of one's ethnic identity. When you're persecuted because of your identity, as a natural defensive reaction, you think of yourself in those terms, but it's important not to fall into the trap, because that's exactly what their enemies want them to do. They want them to think of themselves only as Amhara and not as Ethiopians. So it's very important that while they are defending themselves and taking the necessary measures that their defense requires, that they not lose sight of the necessity to promote a national Ethiopian identity that encompasses all the tribes equally as well.
Have you got a chance to advise Meles or somebody else on the who's on power, to change their policy or their attitude towards Amhara?
Well, my advice was always to the opposition, because I believed that Meles would only change under pressure, and that it was only the opposition that could provide that pressure. Of course, there were times when I published some articles that exposed the wrongdoing of the TPLF regime, that exposed the human rights abuses, that exposed the corruption. And one would hope that normal people in government would read that and think that it suggested some changes, but I never expected really that the TPLF would take my advice. And in fact, the TPLF usually responded to my writings by trying to defame me. The Ethiopian ambassador published letters saying that I had insulted the nation. When I exposed the corruption, there were all of these TPLF paid trolls who attacked me on the internet. So rather than accept the advice that might have helped them to govern better, they instead naturally tried to attack the author and to deny the exposure of their flaws. But I never really expected that they would take my advice, even if it was indirect.
If you got a chance to advise the current Prime Minister Abiy, what you gonna say about the Amhara people?
Well,
I know you don't have the opportunity to say that, but in case if you get a chance and if they can listen, your advice, what will be your advice?
Well, the first thing I would suggest is that Ethiopia should sign the Rome Treaty. The Rome Treaty binds signatory countries to send those who commit crimes against humanity to the International Criminal Court. And I believe that if Ethiopia signed that, it might give those who are contemplating ethnic-based violence second thoughts about whether they really want to do that, because then they would face the risk of winding up in The Hague on trial. So I think that is the first thing that he should do, and it would send an important signal to to those who incite hatred that it's not going to be business as usual, and that those type of methods are no longer going to be acceptable.
What do you think about Abiy's government? Do you think he gonna change the country and will Ethiopia will become a democratic country, or how do you see the current situation of Ethiopia?
Well, first of all, the nature of the demonstrations today is different than it was in those days. The demonstrations recently tend to be much more related to ethnic conflict than people really protesting over a stolen election or protesting for, the right to vote. And as far as my view on Prime Minister Abiy's government, I see him as someone who would like to see Ethiopia stable and democratic, but he is caught between competing power blocks over which he does not have control. And in that sense, he's relatively weak. And it's very difficult for him to get the control over the country needed to implement the remainder of his reforms. But I do not believe that he has a malign intent deliberately to harm the Amhara or any other group. I have many Amhara friends who believe that Abiy wants to hurt them, but my impression is that it's not deliberate on his part so much as he is simply unable to control all of the power elements, some of which are harmful to the Amhara. Interestingly, my Oromo friends believe that he has turned against the Oromo. My Amhara friends believe he has turned against the Amhara. The Tigrayans believe he has turned against the Tigrayans. So he's trying, I think, to make everybody happy, but in the course of doing so, he's making everybody unhappy. But I'm not without sympathy for the difficulty of his position.
Let's back to your book, and can you tell us a little bit about your book? I think it's not yet published, right?
That's right. It's going to be published December 10th on Amazon, and it's a novel. And it's a novel that takes place during the end of the Civil War and through the Meles era.
Money, Blood, and Conscience is a novel by David Steinman that tells the story of the brave Ethiopians who are standing up for freedom. It rips the lid off Ethiopia's hidden Holocaust, an international con game with millions of lives on the line. Money, Blood, and Conscience. How do you stand up for the truth when the truth is too dangerous?
It's focused on Ethiopia, although it contains a love story between an American and an Ethiopian. So in a sense, it's an American-Ethiopian love story, but it's also a political thriller. And I wrote it because in the course of my work with Ethiopia, I had written nonfiction to try to bring Ethiopia's story to Western public. And I thought that a work of fiction might attract a different audience. There are a lot of people who may not follow the news about Ethiopia, but they enjoy reading a love story, they enjoy reading a political thriller, and I thought by using entertainment, I might be able to attract people to the subject matter who might not otherwise take an interest in it. Meles is in the book, Mengistu is mentioned in it, Haile Selassie is mentioned in the book, Berekет Simon even makes a brief appearance, and Dr. Asrat also has an appearance in the book as well.
So you told me earlier, like the book will be available soon, I think on December 10. Where can people get the book? And do you have a plan to translate in Amharic or?
Yes, the book will be available December 10th on Amazon.com. I also hope that Ethiopians will tell all of their Western friends to read the book.
I understand that on the book you hate or you dislike Meles, right?
Yes.
Why do you, as a Western, have such a strong feelings about?
Well, as I mentioned before, my primary interest is poverty reduction. Mm-hmm. And I became involved with democracy promotion because I believed that there is an under-recognized connection between democracy and economic development. Mm-hmm. There are those like Meles who believe in the so-called revolutionary...
and you are a revolutionary too, right?
Well, but not their kind.
Okay.
They believe in what they call revolutionary democracy, which is basically a euphemism for dictatorship. The type of revolution in which I'm interested in is empowering the individual by giving him a real vote and by giving him the right to speak, to associate freely, and to publish what he likes. And I believe those sorts of rights must be given to the extreme poor so that they can demand accountable government. When government doesn't have to answer to the people, it doesn't worry about doing a good job. And I believe that Meles was denying the poor a voice, and he was denying the poor the accountability that they deserved. And as a result, the poor were not getting the government support and the government services that they needed to develop. Mm. As a result, millions of Ethiopians had a much harder life than they might have had otherwise. I'm not saying that democracy is a magic wand that solves all problems overnight, but democracy creates a foundation upon which, with time and hard work, there's a better chance of creating the employment and the investment and the entrepreneurship that creates the jobs that people need to live. So Meles's policies, as I saw them, were denying Ethiopians that extra investment, entrepreneurship, and job creation that they needed, and that was perpetuating the poverty, and that poverty was killing and hurting a lot of people in addition to just giving them a very poor quality of life. So I resented Meles for not giving the people freedom, which I thought was hurting them.
Besides your involvement with Ethiopian democracy revolution, you were also involved in 1986 Haiti's regime. I heard that, and I was trying to take a look. And why do you become a revolutionarist? Well, I know you are an economist by training, right?
Yes. Well, your research is very good. I originally had intended to be a businessman, and I had trained in economics, planning to have a career in international trade. But when I began my early career as a businessman, and I traveled a great deal internationally, especially in developing countries, I was very disturbed by the corruption and the poverty that I saw. And I became convinced that only democracy could help to really solve these problems. And that's how I came to really be a type of world hunger activist, but a world hunger activist who was focused on political reform as a necessary element to improve people's lives. And just by coincidence, I had an opportunity to become involved with the Haitian situation. This was 1985, and the Haitians in those days were suffering under a very terrible dictatorship. The dictator's name was Baby Doc. They used to call him Baby Doc Duvalier. And the suffering under him was terrible. It was like a little TPLF down there. And I had some ideas about how it might be possible to remove him. And basically, that was how I got started. And I had an opportunity to make recommendations to the United States government, which changed the policy against him. And I knew in that case that changing the policy in itself would probably be enough to make him leave power. And indeed, it worked much more quickly than I ever expected. I like to tell people that my first revolution took 6 weeks, and my second one with Ethiopia took 27 years.
Why that happened?
I think Ethiopia was a much more difficult problem. In the case of Haiti, Baby Doc was entirely dependent on U.S. support.
Mm-hmm.
And in the case of Ethiopia, the TPLF, first of all, had that U.S. support, and it was harder to remove that American support up until the very last minute. But also the TPLF had other sources of power that were supporting it. Mm-hmm. Baby Doc really was like a table. He was resting on only one leg, but the TPLF was like a table with many legs, and it took a lot longer to remove all of them.
You released a document about the corruption in Ethiopia in 2017. Do you think that helped Americans to change their mind toward the TPLF?
Well, I did hear that because that article was published in Forbes, which in America is the most influential conservative publication, at least the most influential business publication, that many people in the Trump administration did read it, and perhaps that got them thinking about Ethiopia for the first time. And in the article, which was published in the early days of the Trump administration, I did describe the crisis in Ethiopia as a test of the Trump foreign policy. So I like to think that that may have encouraged the Trump administration to take a closer look at it. I do not believe that my article by itself certainly was the only reason that the United States changed its policy, but I do hope that when the pressures began to build on the EPRDF in 2018, that the article may have contributed to creating a certain policy analysis perspective that may have contributed to the final decision to withdraw the U.S. support from the EPRDF, or at least from the TPLF.
How do you feel about the Prime Minister of Ethiopia's Nobel Peace Prize Award?
The prize is often awarded to encourage a process. For example, President Barack Obama was given the Nobel Prize, I think, in his first year in office, before he had really done a great deal. And many people said that he hasn't done anything to deserve it. But first of all, the prize, as I mentioned, does serve to encourage, but people also do have to recognize that in Obama's case, for example, just the fact that he got elected had such a positive effect on race relations in this country that in itself was a big deal. And it's also true that in Prime Minister Abiy's case, the reforms that he did make in themselves are a very big deal. So I hope that people will see the Nobel Prize as something given to Prime Minister Abiy on behalf of a broader reform process in which many Ethiopians have already been contributors to and must be contributors in the future.
Let me add one more question on this issue. People say that because they believe there is no change in Ethiopia. The first thing is there is no any policy change, policy, ideology, or economic policy. So far, we haven't seen any change. Mm-hmm. And there is no change on the constitution. Mm-hmm. And there is no any change on the federalism system that you mentioned earlier. The ethnic federalism mm-hmm. is a very serious thing in Ethiopia. And there are still people in prison. And within a year, 3,000 plus people are arrested. And this is a data that the government, Abiy's government, released 2 or 3 days ago. Mm-hmm. And still the Amhara people treated as the same thing that TPLF was treating. Mm-hmm. And that's why people raise those issues, and Abiy doesn't deserve to get a prize.
Mm-hmm. Well, as I say, I think the Nobel in his case is meant to try to encourage him. So hopefully the Nobel will serve that purpose of encouraging him to move in a positive direction. I believe that many of the criticisms of people about the lack of progress in the areas you mentioned is legitimate. Mm-hmm. However, I would like to see all of those critics focus on channeling them into an election campaign process. When I ask people who they're going to vote for, most people say, I don't know. When I ask people, where are the debates where these issues can be publicly aired? Where are the panel discussions on media? Where are the political campaigns where politicians can stake out different positions on these issues so that these grievances can be channeled into a political process and people don't think that they have to solve them in the street. Mm-hmm. And I believe that the people themselves must take part in fashioning a pre-election campaign process and participating in it and putting forward candidates who will make speeches and discuss and debate publicly all of these issues, especially the question of nationalism versus ethnic federalism, rather than trying to solve these through street actions and through violence. I want people to believe that these issues can be decided through a democratic system, which means if they really want to keep the country together, people are going to have to accept that once these matters are put to a legitimate vote, whoever loses is going to have to agree to go along with it, even if they don't like it. That's what democracy is all about. They get a chance in the next election to try again. But I really hope that the issues which are dividing Ethiopia can be aired and debated in a peaceful, civil way, and then decided through elections, and especially through an honest, legitimate election that people can have confidence in. I think that once a government has been legitimately elected, then it will have more power to do more about some of these problems.
Do you think that will happen soon in Ethiopia?
Well,
because the system is still there, and the party is still there. I hesitate, personally, I hesitate that will not happen very soon.
I do have a lot of fears about it, but I think a lot depends on the people themselves. If the people really demand the election be held in an honest way, and they keep the pressure on, and they participate themselves in it, if they do whatever's necessary to help provide security for this process, if they encourage other people to get involved in it, if they encourage people to make sure they're registered and to vote, and if they unite so that they have candidates that represent them, who will then go out and debate, then I think there's a possibility. If an honest election is not held, then I think things are going to get a lot worse. So it's vitally important that all Ethiopians really roll up their sleeves and get to work on creating a pre-election campaign process that will allow people to see the different issues in front of them so that they can make informed decisions, and to ensure with a great turnout that the dark forces who want to disrupt the election cannot succeed.
How do you see the current situation in Ethiopia, and what will be your involvement in the future in Ethiopia and specifically in Amhara?
Well, to be frank with you, I believe that I've done what I could to try to encourage the end of the TPLF. I'm happy to always give my opinion, but at this point I think it's time for the people themselves to take advantage of the relative increase in freedom to do what they can to help themselves. As far as the persecution of the Amhara goes, yes, I can certainly provide some advice on nonviolence tactics and other general advice, but I think that the people must unify in their actions. They must coordinate their actions. Recently, there's been some movement towards Amhara unification of the political leadership, or coordination among that, and that's a very, very positive sign. It's very important that people unify. Only when they're unified will they be strong. And people think that unifying means the other guy giving up his differences to agree with you. But people have to look in themselves and understand that they themselves must make compromises, sometimes even painful compromises, to create the necessary unity. But if the Amhara succeed in unifying and demonstrating that they're capable of coordinated action, I believe that they'll be much stronger, and that will have a deterrent effect on those seeking to attack them. At the same time, I think it's vitally important that as the Amhara are able to speak with one voice, they must reach out to the moderates in the other tribes and to find allies within the other tribes who also share their vision of a national identity in which everyone is equal and everybody has a vote and everybody has his human rights, and to build a multi-ethnic coalition of people that share that vision. And it's very important, therefore, that the efforts to force the Amhara to think of themselves only as Amhara be defeated, so that this broader coalition can be created that can then overwhelm the violent extremists.
I have finished my questions. If you have anything that you want to say, it's open to say anything you want, and hopefully we'll meet again after you launch your book. Thank you for coming to our studio.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity very much. It's a great pleasure. I think the only thing I'll say in closing is everybody who has internet access, please remember that goodreads.com website. Click on Want to Read. That will help to promote the book. And please be sure to tell all of your Western friends to read it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Pleasure.
ተመልካቾቻችን እንግዲህ እስካሁን ስትከታተሉት የነበረው ከሚስተር ዴቪድ ስታይመን ጋር የነበረን ቆይታ ነው። ስለተከታተላችሁን እናመሰግናለን። ሌላ ጊዜ ከእርሳቸው ጋር ወይም ደግሞ ከሌላ እንግዳ ጋር በሌሎች ዝግጅቶች እስክንገናኝ እስከዛው ድረስ ሰላም ልትቆዩ እንመኛለን።